1944. A forward aid station just behind the American line, close enough to the fighting that the sound of it never stops. A badly wounded man is brought in, pale, cold, his blood pressure falling, slipping toward the quiet death that takes more wounded men than any other. He is bleeding out, or he has bled out, and the life is draining from him not through his wound now but through the simple fact that a body cannot function without enough blood in it. And then something happens that, to a German medical officer, would have seemed almost impossible this close to the front. They give him blood, not a substitute, not a saline solution to bulk out what was left. Actual blood, or its life-giving fraction, flowing into his veins from a bottle or a bag, replacing what he had lost, bringing his pressure back up, pulling him back from the edge. Here, in a tent, a few miles from the shooting, a man who should have died of blood loss is instead being refilled, and he lives. If you were a German medical officer, you understood transfusion. The science was not a secret, and German medicine was among the best in the world. But you also understood, intimately, why getting blood to a wounded man near the front was one of the hardest problems in all of military medicine, and why, for most of history, and for most armies including your own, it was a problem that was mostly not solved. Because blood is not like bandages. Blood is alive, and it is fragile, and it spoils. It must be matched to the patient or it can kill him. It must be kept cold, or it degrades. It has a limited life even when refrigerated. It must be collected from a healthy donor, tested, typed, stored, transported, and delivered, all within a narrow window, all while keeping it cold, all the way from the donor to a vein in a dying man's arm in a tent near a battlefield. Every step of that chain is difficult, and the chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and near the front, every link is under stress. So the German answer to blood, of necessity, was limited and local. Where transfusion happened, it tended to happen close to the source, direct transfusion from a donor on the spot, or blood collected and used locally, over short distances and short times, because the German system could not maintain the long, cold, complex supply chain that industrial-scale blood delivery required. A German wounded man's chance of receiving blood depended heavily on whether a donor and the means happened to be available, near him, in time. Often they were not. And the American wounded man, in his tent a few miles from the front, was being given blood that might have been donated by a civilian in a town thousands of miles away, weeks earlier, and carried across an ocean to reach his vein at exactly the moment he needed it. The conclusion a German officer might reach, hearing of this, would be disbelief, and then perhaps the familiar dismissal, extravagance, the Americans lavishing impossible resources on individual soldiers, shipping blood across the world as though each ordinary infantryman were a head of state. He would be wrong, and the thing he dismissed was one of the most remarkable logistical and medical achievements of the entire war. A nationwide, ocean-spanning system for collecting the blood of millions of civilians and delivering it, fresh and cold and alive, into the veins of wounded men on battlefields half a world away. This is not a story about blood. This is a forensic audit of the difference between an army that could give a wounded man blood only if it happened to be available nearby, and an army that built an industrial pipeline to carry the gift of life from a civilian's arm at home to a dying soldier's vein at the front, and of what that pipeline says about how the two nations valued the single wounded man. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to begin by being clear that the German failure here was not a failure of medical knowledge, because German medicine understood blood and transfusion perfectly well. Blood typing, the science of transfusion, the understanding of blood loss and shock, none of this was hidden from German doctors, who were among the most sophisticated in the world. The German failure, as everywhere in this series, was not in knowing what to do. It was in building the system to do it at scale, across distance, under the conditions of a losing war. And blood is a peculiarly demanding thing to supply, which is why no army before this war had truly solved it, and why it is such a revealing test of a nation's logistical and industrial capacity. Think about what a large-scale blood supply actually requires. It requires, first, a huge population of willing donors, organized and mobilized to give blood in enormous quantity. It requires the medical infrastructure to collect that blood safely, to test it, to type it. It requires a method of preserving it, refrigeration, and the chemistry of anticoagulants and preservatives that let blood be stored rather than used immediately. It requires a cold chain, an unbroken sequence of refrigeration from collection to delivery, across whatever distance separates the donor from the patient. And it requires the transport to move it fast, because even refrigerated blood does not last long, so the whole journey from arm to arm must be completed within a limited window. Every one of those requirements is hard, and together, they constitute a system that only a nation of enormous organizational and industrial capacity could build and sustain. And Germany, fighting a multi-front war under blockade with collapsing logistics, could not build or sustain it at the scale that battlefield medicine demanded. So the German system relied more heavily on alternatives and on local, small-scale solutions. Direct transfusion, donor to patient, on the spot, where a donor could be found, blood collected and used over short distances and short times. And, importantly, the Germans made significant use of blood substitutes and plasma expanders, solutions that could restore blood volume even if they could not fully replace blood's oxygen-carrying function. These were real and useful, and they saved lives, but they were not the same as a reliable supply of actual blood delivered to the point of wounding, and they could not do everything that whole blood could do for a man who had lost a great deal of it. And there was a deeper structural problem, the same one that runs through every German story in this series. The blood supply chain, like every other supply chain, competed for the same collapsing resources: the refrigeration, the transport, the organization, the fuel, that everything else needed, and that Germany increasingly did not have. A cold chain running from the homeland to the front requires refrigerated transport moving reliably over long distances, and by the last years of the war, German transport was breaking down under bombing and fuel shortage, unable to reliably move even ammunition and food, let alone maintain a delicate refrigerated pipeline for something as perishable as blood. So the German wounded man's access to blood was, in effect, a lottery weighted against him. If he was lucky, if a donor was available, if the means were at hand, if he was in a place and time where local transfusion was possible, he might receive blood. If he was not lucky, he received a volume expander, or a substitute, or nothing, and he took his chances with the blood loss that killed so many. That is the German calculus. Full knowledge of transfusion and its value, undermined by the inability to build and sustain the enormous, refrigerated, long-distance, industrial-scale supply chain that reliable battlefield blood delivery required, so that German wounded received blood inconsistently, locally, and by luck, while the system that might have delivered it reliably was beyond the reach of a blockaded, overstretched, collapsing war economy. Now let us look at the pipeline the Americans built from a civilian's arm to a soldier's vein. Part 2. The American Answer. The American Blood Program was one of the great organizational achievements of the war, and like so much in this series, it began not with the army, but with the civilian nation behind it, mobilized on a massive scale to give a part of itself, quite literally, to its soldiers. Start with the donors. The United States organized a vast national blood donation program, largely through the Red Cross, that collected blood from millions of civilian donors across the country. Ordinary Americans, housewives, workers, students, the old, the young, rolled up their sleeves and gave blood, again and again, in a nationwide mobilization that turned the civilian population into a living reservoir for the wounded at the front. Millions of units of blood were collected over the course of the war, a river of donated blood flowing from the arms of civilians into the medical system. Then the science, and here the Americans, building on international research, made or scaled up crucial breakthroughs that turned blood from a thing that had to be used immediately into a thing that could be banked, stored, and shipped. The first was plasma. Blood plasma, the liquid fraction of blood, without the red cells, has enormous advantages for battlefield use. It does not need to be matched to the patient's blood type, so it can be given to anyone without the delay and difficulty of typing. And crucially, it can be dried, freeze-dried into a powder that is stable, storable, and shippable without refrigeration, and then reconstituted with sterile water at the point of use. Dried plasma was a revolution for forward medicine. It could be carried far forward, stored without a cold chain, and administered quickly to treat the shock of blood loss, restoring volume and pulling men back from the edge. It was not a full substitute for whole blood. It lacked the red cells that carry oxygen, but it was a powerful, portable, life-saving tool that could go where whole blood could not, and the Americans produced and distributed it on an enormous scale. And the man whose work was central to the mass production of plasma and to the very concept of the large-scale blood bank was an American physician named Charles Drew, a brilliant surgeon and researcher whose pioneering work on the storage and processing of plasma helped make the whole system possible, and who organized early large-scale Blood for Britain and American blood bank efforts. And there is a bitter and important part of his story that belongs in any honest telling. Drew was a black man in a segregated country, and the American military and Red Cross, for a shameful period, insisted on segregating blood by the race of the donor, a policy with no scientific basis whatsoever, blood being blood, that Drew and many others rightly condemned as the racism it was. The man whose work helped save countless lives through blood plasma lived in a nation that segregated the very blood he had helped make available. That contradiction, extraordinary scientific and organizational achievement running alongside shameful racial injustice, is one we have met before in this series, and it is a real part of the American story, and it must be told alongside the triumph. Then the second breakthrough, whole blood, delivered fresh, across the ocean. As the war went on, it became clear that dried plasma, valuable as it was not enough. That men who had lost large amounts of blood needed whole blood, with its oxygen-carrying red cells, and needed it as far forward as possible. And so the Americans built the thing that most astonished observers, a refrigerated pipeline that carried whole blood, collected from donors in the United States, across the Atlantic and Pacific, kept cold the entire way, and delivered it fresh to the combat theaters, all the way forward to the aid stations near the front. This was an extraordinary logistical feat. It meant maintaining an unbroken cold chain across thousands of miles of ocean and land. It meant flying blood by air to get it there within its limited life. It meant a system of collection, testing, typing, refrigeration, air transport, and forward distribution so well organized that blood donated by a civilian in America could be in the vein of a wounded soldier in Europe within days, still fresh, still alive, still able to do its work. By the later part of the war, whole blood was flowing to the front in quantity, and the survival of the badly wounded improved accordingly. Put it all together, the millions of civilian donors, the dried plasma that could go anywhere, the whole blood cold chain spanning oceans, and you have a system that could give a wounded American, in a tent near the front, the blood he needed to live, drawn from the veins of his own countrymen, thousands of miles away. It is one of the most direct and literal expressions in the entire war of the bond between the home front and the fighting man, the civilian's blood, in the soldier's veins, delivered by a pipeline of extraordinary reach and sophistication. Part 3. The River of Steel. The blood program connects to every other theme of this channel, and it is worth tracing the connections, because blood is where several of the American advantages we have examined converge into a single, life-saving whole. It connects, first, to the medical system we examined in an earlier audit, the forward surgery, the rapid evacuation, the whole chain designed to keep the wounded alive. Blood is the fuel of that entire system. All the forward surgery in the world cannot save a man who has bled out, and all the rapid evacuation cannot help a man who dies of shock before he reaches the surgeon. Blood and plasma, delivered far forward, were what kept men alive long enough for the rest of the medical chain to work on them. The blood pipeline was the foundation under the whole edifice of American battlefield medicine. It connects to the theme of the civilian nation mobilized for war. The blood came from ordinary civilians, organized and mobilized on a massive scale, exactly as the same nation was mobilized to build the tanks and the trucks and the shells. The blood program was the civilian war effort in its most intimate form, not building a machine, but giving a part of one's own body for the wounded. It is the same total mobilization of a whole society that produced everything else in this series, expressed in the most personal way imaginable. It connects to the theme of logistics and the cold chain. Maintaining a refrigerated pipeline across oceans is a logistical achievement of the same order as the fuel pipeline and the food supply, requiring the same industrial and organizational capacity, the same abundance of transport, the same air delivery capability. The blood-cold chain rode on the same vast logistical machine that carried everything else, and it required that machine's full sophistication to work. And it connects, above all, to the deepest theme of this entire channel, the value placed on the individual wounded man. The blood pipeline existed for one reason: to save the life of the individual soldier who had been badly wounded. Every unit of blood shipped across an ocean was an investment in one man's survival. And the willingness to build such an elaborate, expensive, sophisticated system for the purpose of saving individual wounded men is once again the expression of a philosophy about the worth of the ordinary soldier that runs through everything the Americans did. The Germans, of necessity, had to let many wounded men take their chances with blood loss. The Americans built an ocean-spanning pipeline so that the individual wounded man would not have to. And behind the whole thing, as always, was scale and abundance. Millions of units of blood collected, enormous quantities of plasma dried and shipped, a cold chain spanning the globe, the air transport to move it fast, the organizational capacity to run it all reliably. Only a nation of America's industrial, organizational, and logistical wealth could have built it. And the fact that America did build it, that it chose to devote this staggering effort to the delivery of blood to individual wounded men, is one more measure of the gap between the two ways of war. And there is one detail that captures the sheer audacity of the thing better than any statistic, which is the speed of it. Consider what had to be true for whole blood to reach the front, still alive. Blood, even refrigerated and treated with preservatives, has only a limited life before it can no longer be safely used. Which means the entire journey, from the donor's arm in an American city, through testing and typing and refrigeration, onto an aircraft, across an ocean, through the theater distribution system, forward to an aid station, and into the wounded man's vein, had to be completed inside that window. Days, not weeks. To move a perishable, living, temperature-sensitive substance across the width of the world and get it into a specific dying man's body while it was still good is a logistical achievement that would challenge a peacetime system with every advantage. The Americans did it in wartime, across contested oceans, in enormous quantity, as a matter of routine. The blood in that bottle in the aid station had, quite possibly, been inside a civilian in Ohio the week before. That is the pipeline, and there had never been anything like it. Part 4. The German Realization. The Germans understood the value of what the Americans had, and they understood their own inability to match it, and the realization followed the familiar pattern of recognition without remedy. German medical officers understood transfusion and understood the value of a reliable blood supply. They could see, in captured American medical supplies and in the survival of American wounded, that the enemy had a blood delivery capability they could not match. They knew what they lacked, but knowing did not help, because the blood pipeline, like everything else the Germans could not build, required resources and organization and logistical reach that a collapsing Germany simply did not possess. They could not organize a national donation program of the American scale, in a nation increasingly consumed by total war and, in its final phase, disintegration. They could not maintain a refrigerated cold chain across the distances involved, when their transport could not reliably move even basic supplies. They could not build the air delivery system that got fresh blood forward fast. Every element of the American blood pipeline depended on a stability, an abundance, and an organizational capacity that Germany had lost or never had. And so the German wounded man continued to face the blood loss lottery, receiving actual blood inconsistently, and by luck, relying more on substitutes and volume expanders, dying in numbers that a better blood supply might have reduced. The German medical services did what they could with what they had, and German doctors were skilled and dedicated, but they were working without the industrial pipeline that made the American difference, and men died for lack of it who might have lived. And the deeper German realization, available to the perceptive, was the one this channel keeps arriving at from every direction. The blood pipeline was not just a medical achievement, it was a statement about the relationship between the nation and the wounded soldier. It said that the nation would mobilize its own civilian population to give blood, would build an ocean-spanning system of extraordinary cost and sophistication, would devote all of this to the survival of the individual wounded man, because the individual wounded man was worth it. And that statement, like the sent-home wounded and the crew survivable tank and all the rest, was one the German system could not make, partly because it could not afford to, and partly because, at its ideological core, it did not fully believe the individual soldier was worth that kind of investment. The German medical officer, watching an American wounded man receive fresh blood a few miles from the front and live, was watching the visible end of an invisible pipeline that ran back across an ocean to the arm of a civilian donor, a pipeline that embodied, in the most literal possible form, a nation's determination that its wounded should not die for lack of the one thing every bleeding man needs. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle was saved by a transfusion in that war, or if he or someone in your family gave blood, on the home front, in the great civilian donation drives that filled the pipeline, or worked in the blood banks, the labs, the air transport, the aid stations that delivered it, I would be grateful to hear their name in the comments. The blood program was a partnership between the civilian who gave and the soldier who received, and both ends of it deserve to be remembered. And the debt owed to Charles Drew and to all who gave despite a nation that did not yet treat them as equals belongs in the record too. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1945. The war ends, and the blood program, having saved uncounted lives, becomes the foundation of the modern civilian blood banking systems that save lives to this day. One more case of a wartime achievement becoming a permanent gift to the peace that followed. Every modern blood bank, every transfusion that saves a life in a hospital today, descends in part from the systems built and proven under the pressure of that war. So here is the verdict. The German wounded man's access to blood was a matter of luck and locality, because Germany, for all its medical knowledge, could not build the enormous, refrigerated, ocean-spanning, industrially organized pipeline that reliable battlefield blood delivery required. Its wounded received blood inconsistently, relied more on substitutes, and died in numbers a better system might have saved, not because German doctors were less skilled, but because the nation behind them could not sustain the pipeline. The American wounded man received blood as a matter of system because the United States built exactly that pipeline, millions of civilian donors, dried plasma that could go anywhere, and a whole blood cold chain that carried fresh blood across oceans to the veins of wounded men at the front. It was one of the great organizational and medical achievements of the war, and it existed for a single purpose: to keep the individual wounded soldier alive. The German officer who heard that American troops had fresh blood at the front and thought extravagance was making the last version of the error his army made about everything American. He saw impossible resources lavished on the individual soldier. He did not understand that the lavishing was the whole point, that a nation which would build an ocean-spanning pipeline to put a civilian's blood into a soldier's vein was a nation that had decided the individual wounded man was worth almost any effort to save, and that this decision, repeated across every domain of the war, was itself one of the deepest reasons that nation won. The Germans gave their wounded blood when they could. The Americans built a pipeline from a civilian's arm at home to a soldier's vein at the front, and gave their wounded blood almost whenever they needed it, because they had decided that no American should bleed to death for want of the blood that millions of his countrymen were lining up to give. The Germans could afford to lose the men that blood might have saved. The Americans could not bear to, and they built, to prevent it, one of the most remarkable pipelines of the entire war. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these. More systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the people who gave. Nobody makes a film about a woman in a small American town rolling up her sleeve in a church hall to give a pint of blood, one of millions who did the same, not knowing whose vein it would end up in, only that a wounded boy somewhere far away would need it. And nobody makes a film about the men who kept that blood cold across an ocean, or flew it forward, or hung the bottle in the aid station and watched a dying man's color come back. They were not on any battlefield. The donor never saw the soldier, and the soldier never knew the donor's name. But between them ran a pipeline that carried the most literal gift one person can give another, a part of their own living body, from the safe interior of a nation at war to the very edge of the fighting, and into the vein of a stranger who would live because of it. Mostly, when an American soldier needed blood, it was there, given freely by someone he would never meet, carried across the world by a system built for the single purpose of keeping him alive. They deserve to be remembered, the donors, the blood bank workers, the men of the cold chain, and Charles Drew, whose science made so much of it possible, by the quiet, staggering truth that a nation reached across an ocean to put the blood of its civilians into the veins of its wounded, because it had decided that not one of them should die if giving a part of themselves could save him.